The 17th of September 1939, Lwów, eastern Poland. The sound of engines echoed across the misted valley before dawn. Captain Jan Kowalski stood beside a ruined checkpoint, watching columns of Soviet tanks emerge from the fog. Their red stars gleamed like fresh wounds against the steel. Civilians cheered weakly, some even wept with relief. For weeks they had prayed for help, believing the Soviets were marching to repel the Germans. A Red Army officer stepped from his vehicle, smiling. "You are safe now," he said in halting Polish. "Comrade Stalin has come to liberate you." He offered bread, cigarettes, even medical aid to wounded Polish soldiers. For a moment, hope flickered through the exhaustion, but then came the orders. Weapons confiscated, maps seized, officers separated from enlisted men. The so-called liberators herded them toward railway yards under armed escort. Kowalski's translator whispered, trembling, "They're sending us east, not home." As the sun rose over the borderlands, the illusion of rescue dissolved into dread. From the west, black smoke marked the German advance. From the east, the red banners of the Soviets fluttered above captured villages. Poland was being swallowed whole by two empires at once. Inside his pocket diary, Kowalski wrote one sentence that would outlive him. "We welcomed them as allies. By nightfall, we were their prisoners." The liberation had begun, and it would lead not to freedom, but into the frozen heart of Siberia. By late September 1939, Poland no longer existed on any map. To the west, the Wehrmacht had torn through Warsaw in 3 brutal weeks. To the east, the Red Army crossed the frontier under the false banner of protection. But there was no protection, only partition. At Brest-Litovsk, Soviet and German officers shook hands over the ruins, dividing Poland like accountants balancing a ledger. For men like Captain Jan Kowalski, who had survived the German onslaught only to fall into Soviet hands, the betrayal was beyond comprehension. Soviet propaganda leaflets dropped from planes claimed the Red Army had come to rescue Slavic brothers from fascism. In truth, their orders came directly from the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the agreement that had condemned Poland before the war even began. The captives were told they would be processed for relocation. Instead, their names were entered into NKVD lists, bureaucratic death warrants written in ink and stamped with red stars. Within weeks, over 250,000 Polish soldiers, officers, and civilians had vanished behind Soviet lines. Families waited for letters that would never come. At the camp in Kozelsk, Kowalski and his men clung to rumors that they might be exchanged for Soviet prisoners held by the Germans, that the Allies would intervene, that this temporary detainment would soon end. But the guards' silence spoke louder than any promise. Each day, new prisoners arrived, teachers, doctors, priests, anyone the Soviets considered intelligentsia. The Polish army had been disarmed, but Stalin feared their minds more than their rifles. As snow began to fall over the forests of Smolensk, the prisoners noticed a strange efficiency in their captors' record-keeping long lists, meticulously sorted by rank and profession. Kowalski didn't yet know what those lists meant, but he could feel their weight. Somewhere deep inside, he wrote again in his diary, "They tell us we are being relocated, but no one returns." It was the calm before a storm that would bury truth beneath Siberian ice. The journey began before dawn, under the crack of rifle butts on frozen steel. "Line up! Leave everything!" shouted the Soviet guards. Dozens of Polish officers stumbled into the rail yard, still half asleep, their breath rising in clouds beneath a pale September sky. Ahead of them, rows of wooden boxcars waited, each one a prison on wheels. At first, Captain Jan Kowalski thought it was temporary. They would be taken to a larger camp, processed, perhaps exchanged, but the doors slammed shut, and heavy iron latches sealed from the outside. Darkness swallowed them whole. Within minutes, the train jerked forward, heading east farther east than any of them had imagined. Inside, the stench grew unbearable. 40 men in a car, no windows, only a bucket in the corner. The frost crept in through gaps in the wood. Water froze before it hit the floor. After the second day, Even hope began to stiffen with the cold. Through small cracks, Kowalski caught glimpses of endless birch forests, then open plains, then snow, always snow. Towns grew smaller, stations emptier. At each stop, Soviet soldiers tossed in frozen bread and buckets of water like they were feeding livestock. On the fourth night, someone whispered, "We're past the Urals." No one believed him until the air itself seemed to burn their lungs. The world outside was white and merciless. When the train finally stopped, a voice shouted, "Welcome to your new home, Siberia." The laughter that followed was colder than the wind. The men stumbled out into a landscape that seemed untouched by life. Barbed wire half buried in snow, wooden barracks like skeletons against the horizon, guards in fur hats watching from towers. A red banner fluttered above the gate. "Work brings freedom." Kowalski stared at it for a long time. The words were familiar, but the place was not freedom, it was the edge of the world. He opened his diary again and wrote with a trembling hand, "They said liberation. They meant exile." The real shock was not that the Soviets had lied, but that so many had believed them. When the sun rose over the Siberian horizon, it revealed not a camp but a machine, an entire system built for exhaustion. Rows of barracks stood in perfect, miserable alignment, separated by barbed wire and watchtowers. Everything had been calculated, the distance between huts, the number of men per bunk, even the rations that would barely sustain life. Captain Jan Kowalski stood in line among hundreds of prisoners as the guards shouted orders in Russian. The commandant's voice echoed through a loudspeaker. "You are not prisoners. You are workers of the Soviet Union. Here, everyone works or dies." The logistics of suffering were immaculate. Each morning, exactly 4 a.m., the sirens screamed. Prisoners were marched in columns 5 wide, hundreds deep to the labor sites. No one spoke, speech wasted energy. Every movement had been standardized. How long they walked, when they rested, how much bread they received. Soviet efficiency had replaced humanity. Breakfast was a metal bowl of thin cabbage soup, 200 grams of bread, and a teaspoon of sugar on Sundays if the guards remembered. The men quickly learned the rhythm. 2 gulps too fast and you'd be hungry all day, 2 gulps too slow, and someone might steal your portion. The work defied comprehension. They felled trees in -40 degrees, the axes bouncing off frozen bark. The ground itself resisted the shovels, turning every strike into an act of defiance. Those who collapsed were left where they fell until evening roll call when the bodies were counted like broken tools. The Soviets called it labor normalization. Every task had quotas, every man a number. Failure meant reduced rations meant death. It was efficient without mercy. Kowalski wrote, "The system runs like a factory of misery. The guards record everything, how much we cut, how far we walk, how long before one of us stops breathing." At night, the prisoners compared notes. The Soviet guards didn't need to beat them. Hunger and exhaustion did the job better. The machine didn't kill with cruelty, it killed with order. And yet, the most chilling realization came when Kowalski saw new barracks being built by prisoners for prisoners not yet captured. The system was expanding. He closed his eyes and whispered, "They are planning for eternity." The Soviet machine had perfected the logistics of despair. The Siberian wind howled like a living thing as Lieutenant Andrzej Lewandowski, once a military medic in Warsaw, was summoned to what the Soviets called the infirmary. The word itself promised relief. What he found inside promised the opposite. The hospital was a converted tool shed, its walls lined with frost, its shelves stacked not with medicine but with ledgers. A Red Army sergeant, smoking in the doorway, sneered, "If they can stand, they can work. If not, write their name." Inside, 20 men lay on wooden planks. Their breath condensed in the freezing air, drifting upward like ghosts. Frostbite had devoured fingers and toes. Infections turned small cuts into mortal wounds. The air reeked of pus, sweat, and kerosene. The only sound was coughing slowly, mechanical, endless. Lewandowski wrote later, "There was no healing here, only bookkeeping. They recorded the dying with the same precision they measured timber quotas. The medical supplies were rationed like bullets. 1 tin of iodine served the entire camp. Bandages were stripped from corpses, boiled and reused. Penicillin, the miracle drug he had heard of, was a myth whispered about like a fairy tale. When a man collapsed on the work site, he was loaded onto a sled and dragged to the infirmary. Most never left. Those who did were returned to labor half dead. Survival itself became a cruel arithmetic: save energy or freeze, rest and starve, move and bleed. The Soviet doctors, often political officers, treated illness as weakness. Fever meant sabotage, infection meant laziness. One prisoner who begged for rest was accused of malingering and sentenced to a week without food. He didn't survive the second day. In rare moments of humanity, Lewandowski smuggled bits of charcoal to mark fevers, bits of cloth for bandages. Once, he used a fishbone to drain an abscess, saving a man who later called him the doctor of the damned. But the true shock came when the prisoners discovered that the Soviets had their own separate medical hut, heated, well-stocked, guarded. Soviet soldiers received morphine, clean linen, and rest. The prisoners received a shovel and silence. Lewandowski's final diary entry from that winter read, "Here, death is not a tragedy. It is an appointment." The Soviet system had weaponized medicine not to heal, but to remind every man that even his pain belonged to the state. Spring crept into Siberia like a ghost melting the snow, but not the cruelty. With the thaw came new orders. The Polish prisoners were to attend political education sessions. The Soviets called it re-education. The prisoners soon learned it was something far stranger. In the drafty assembly hall, red banners fluttered above the podium, each stamped with Lenin's face. A Soviet commissar stood before them, his voice sharp, his smile colder than the air outside. "Comrades," he began, "you are no longer prisoners. You are brothers, workers of the socialist future." For men who had watched friends die in the snow, the words were surreal. Brothers? Lieutenant Marek Zielinski, who once taught literature in Krakow, whispered to his bunkmate, "They call us comrades as they starve us. Is this what liberation means?" The cultural transformation began subtly. Radios blared Soviet marches from dawn to dusk. Guards demanded prisoners sing revolutionary songs during roll call. Those who refused were marked as reactionaries. Every wall displayed posters of Stalin as father of nations. The irony was unbearable for men who hadn't seen their own fathers in years. The Soviets even redefined punishment as privilege. Political offenders were assigned to ideological labor, translating propaganda leaflets or painting portraits of Soviet heroes. Zielinski, with his neat handwriting, was forced to copy speeches glorifying the revolution. Each word he wrote felt like an act of betrayal. And yet, the real shock was not in the brutality but in the conviction. The guards, many barely older than the prisoners, believed in the ideology completely. They quoted Marx between cigarette drags, spoke of class enemies as if discussing mathematics. Their faith was mechanical, their cruelty methodical. When a prisoner asked why they were held if Poland was liberated, a commissar smiled and replied, "Because you still think like Poles. We will teach you to think like comrades." For some, resistance faded into exhaustion. For others, like Zielinski, survival meant pretending. He joined the songs, mouthed the slogans, all while whispering prayers in the dark. One night, he carved into the wooden barrack wall, "They do not break us with pain, they drown us in words." The Soviet system had built not just a prison, but a culture, a world where truth itself froze to death in the Siberian cold. For the Poles, this was not liberation, it was captivity with a vocabulary. By midsummer, the Poles were transported deeper east to a camp near Novosibirsk, where the Soviets promised better conditions. For days, the prisoners imagined real barracks, thicker clothing, perhaps even bread that didn't taste of sawdust. But when the train doors opened, they were greeted not by comfort, but by contradiction. The camp commandant stood beside a newly erected billboard that read, "The USSR land of abundance and equality." Behind it stretched a wasteland of mud, broken machinery, and skeletal men hauling logs like animals. Sergeant Antoni Wojcik, once a tailor from Warsaw, muttered, "If this is abundance, then what does famine look like?" The shock came not from deprivation, they had grown used to that, but from the illusion of prosperity. Propaganda films were shown in the evenings, smiling Soviet workers, overflowing factories, children waving red flags beside shining tractors. The prisoners sat in silence, watching images of a paradise that existed only on the projector wall. Outside, the guards ate their rations separately, black bread, salted herring, and thin soup. Even they complained of hunger. One whispered to a prisoner in broken Polish, "The party says we are rich. Maybe the party should eat here." When a shipment of supplies arrived, clothing marked, "For the people's heroes," the Poles were forced to unload it. They uncrated fine wool coats, shoes, and cigarettes labelled, "For front-line morale." None of it was for them. Within hours, the best items were gone, siphoned off by officers who sold them on the black market. Wojcik watched in disbelief as guards traded American-made canned food, stamped Lend-Lease Aid, for vodka. "They drink what was meant for their soldiers," he wrote. "They sell what was meant for victory." Once he found a single tin of condensed milk left behind. It had English writing on it, proof that even the Soviet miracle was being fed by Western supplies. He hid it for weeks, opening it on Christmas Eve. The sweetness brought tears he hadn't shed since capture. The deeper truth became undeniable. The Soviet Empire's abundance was borrowed, its strength sustained by deception. The workers were starving, the soldiers scrounging, the officers thriving. The system fed only itself. In one of his last diary entries, Wojcik wrote, "We are witnessing a world built on hunger and pride, where the only luxury is the lie." For the Poles, this was the moment they understood. Even the illusion of plenty could be a weapon. The Soviets called it progress, the prisoners called it the furnace. By late 1941, thousands of Polish POWs were transferred from forest labor to the industrial heart of Siberia, sprawling complexes where chimneys pierced the clouds and smoke blotted out the sky. From afar, the factories looked like monuments to modernity. Up close, they were cathedrals of despair, powered not by machinery, but by human exhaustion. Lieutenant Piotr Malinowski, an engineer before the war, could hardly believe what he saw. "They claim to build the future," he wrote, "but they are melting men into metal." The factory was a steelworks outside Magnitogorsk, one of Stalin's industrial miracles. Production was constant, deafening, relentless. Molten rivers of iron hissed and roared through trenches cut into the earth. Sparks showered the prisoners as they shoveled ore into furnaces that reached 1,000 degrees. The air tasted of iron and sweat. A single misstep meant death, a slip on the catwalk, a spark in the wrong place, a collapse from hunger. Yet quotas never changed. Each man was expected to move 800 kilograms of ore daily or lose his food ration. Malinowski observed that even Soviet workers toiled beside them, thin, hollow-eyed men who labored in silence under the gaze of political officers. They feared the clipboard more than the furnace. A failed quota was not just a statistic, it was treason. At night, the prisoners were shown films about industrial triumphs, smiling workers, heroic engineers, banners declaring, "Steel is strength, labor is glory." But the reality was filth, burns, and death. The Soviets filmed propaganda by day and buried corpses by night. One prisoner, Corporal Stanislaw Wojna, recorded a grim detail in his hidden notebook. "Every furnace consumes 50 tons of ore and one man's life. They call it the cost of progress. Even water became an instrument of control. The guards rationed it by the hour, claiming the pipes were frozen, yet the officers' baths ran hot every evening." Malinowski's engineering mind saw through it all. "They build giants," he wrote, "but the giants are hollow, machines without maintenance, buildings without foundations, plans without mercy." When the whistle blew at midnight, ending another shift, the men shuffled back through the snow ash, clinging to their faces like war paint. The Soviets had achieved industrial greatness, but it stood upon a mountain of bones. Winter returned to Siberia with vengeance. The temperature plunged below -50, turning breath into glass and sweat into ice. The camp's fences vanished beneath snowdrifts taller than men. Hope had frozen long ago. And yet, amid the cruelty, something impossible began to stir. One morning, Private Tomasz Krawik collapsed on the march back from the logging site. The guards barked for him to rise. He didn't move. The others knew the rule to stop was to die. But then, a Soviet sentry stepped forward. The man was young, barely 20. His uniform hung loose, his rifle slung awkwardly. Instead of striking Tomasz, he knelt and covered him with his own cloak. For a moment, the entire column stopped. No one spoke. The guard lifted the fainted Pole and dragged him back toward camp. That night, Tomasz awoke in the infirmary with a steaming bowl beside him, cabbage soup, richer than anything he'd tasted in months. The nurse, a woman from Smolensk, whispered, "My brother was taken by the Germans. Maybe you have a brother too." It was the first act of mercy any prisoner had seen from a Soviet hand. Word spread through the barracks like fire through dry straw. Some said the guard was punished, others that he was transferred. No one ever saw him again. But for the prisoners, his small kindness became legend. Even in that frozen hell, fragments of humanity survived hidden beneath uniforms, smuggled past ideology. A guard shared tobacco when no one was watching. A Russian cook slipped extra bread crusts to sick men. A nurse hummed a Polish lullaby learned from her grandmother. Lieutenant Zielinski wrote, "They taught us fear in every language, but kindness needs no translation." The men began carving crosses and tiny figures from splinters of birch, leaving them near the infirmary door as silent offerings not to God, but to the memory of the unknown soldier who had chosen compassion over command. For a single winter night, the boundaries between captor and captive blurred. In the endless snow of Siberia, a single human gesture had survived the empire of cruelty, and for the first time, the Poles began to believe that not every Russian was their enemy. It wasn't freedom, but it was proof that even in the coldest system on earth, warmth could still be smuggled through kindness. In the summer of 1941, as Hitler's armies stormed east, Moscow trembled beneath the sound of its own illusions collapsing. Stalin, who had once boasted of friendship with Germany, now faced invasion. And in that chaos, the impossible happened. He reached out to the very Poles his regime had tried to erase. For the half-dead prisoners scattered across the Soviet Union, the news arrived like a rumor too dangerous to believe. Word passed through the camps. Poland and Russia are allies now. No one cheered. They had seen too much to trust words. In a cramped office in Moscow, General Władysław Sikorski, leader of the Polish government in exile, faced Soviet diplomat Ivan Mayski. The air smelled of tobacco and tension. The two men signed what history would call the Sikorski-Mayski Agreement, a fragile promise of amnesty for Polish prisoners and the creation of a Polish army on Soviet soil. But for the prisoners in the camps, amnesty was a word without meaning. How could one be pardoned for a crime never committed? When the guards announced it officially, laughter rippled through the barracks dry, hollow laughter that froze in the air. Still, change began to flicker. Commanders who once shouted now spoke with strained politeness. Lists of names were drawn. Those released would form the new army of General Anders, an army of ghosts resurrected from beneath the ice. Captain Jan Kowalski, who had not spoken in weeks, whispered to his bunkmate, "If they're freeing us, it means they need us. And if they need us, we are alive again." The men began preparing, shaving with shards of metal, straightening rags into uniforms. Hope returned cautiously, like a fire coaxed from wet wood. But not everyone was listed. Thousands remained forgotten, buried in the paperwork of Soviet cruelty. The missing names would one day lead to a forest called Katyn. For now, the survivors were herded onto trains once again, not to Siberia this time, but toward the uncertain promise of freedom. As the wheels clattered east to south, through smoke and dawn, the Poles realized this was no rescue. It was a bargain with desperation, and the price would soon become clear. The trains heading south did not feel like freedom. They felt like evacuation from a graveyard. Every station they passed was lined with hollow-eyed civilians, evacuees, orphans, soldiers who had forgotten what victory meant. The Soviets called it release. To the Poles, it was to escape eastward, toward the unknown. For the first time in years, the prisoners were unshackled, though still under guard. They carried no weapons, no maps, only faith that the road ahead led somewhere better than Siberia. "We were like ghosts," wrote Corporal Marian Sadowski, "not alive, not dead, just drifting east with the wind." The journey was chaos wrapped in motion. Rusted boxcars overflowed with men too weak to stand. At one stop, a mother handed her starving child through the window to a passing soldier, whispering, "Take him south." No one knew if he survived. Food was scarce, water scarcer. Yet the mood was different now, not hope exactly, but hunger for it. At the stations of Tashkent and Samarkand, Red Army guards shouted orders as exhausted Poles stumbled into sunlight for the first time in years. The warmth felt unreal, almost offensive after the cold brutality of Siberia. It was here that the first rumours began to whisper of a Polish force gathering under General Władysław Anders. Men who had been digging graves now dreamed of wearing uniforms again. "We were told we would fight for freedom," Sadowski wrote, "but we didn't yet know whose freedom." Disease stalked them, typhus, cholera, dysentery taking hundreds before they reached the next camp. But the direction mattered. They were moving away from the frost, away from the silence of the dead. By the time they reached the southern camps near Krasnovodsk, many could barely walk. Yet when they saw the Caspian Sea glittering in the distance, tears froze on sunburned faces. They were no longer prisoners of Stalin, but neither were they free men yet. They were survivors between empires, racing east to escape both death and deliverance. The truth did not arrive as a shout. It came as a whisper passed from one survivor to another, carried by rumour, confirmed by silence. In 1943, when German forces uncovered the mass graves in the Katyn forest, the world recoiled. Thousands of Polish officers, their hands bound, each shot through the skull, executed not by the Nazis but by the Soviets. For the men of Anders' army, scattered now across Persia and the Middle East, it was the final wound, the answer to a question they had been too afraid to ask. Captain Jerzy Nowak, who had spent 2 years searching for his missing brother, read the names broadcast over the radio. His brother was among them. "I felt the world tilt," he wrote. "All that time I cursed the Germans, and the bullet came from the east. The revelation tore through the Polish ranks like shrapnel. The Soviets denied it, blaming the Nazis. But the Poles had seen enough of both regimes to recognize a lie when they heard one." The memories flooded back, the vanished officers, the empty barracks, the unexplained lists. In Tehran, General Anders gathered his men and said quietly, "We march on, but never forget where our comrades lie." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of knowing. For the survivors, Katyn was more than a massacre. It was proof that their liberation had been a disguise for extermination. "Now we understand," wrote Nowak. "We were not rescued by the Soviets. We had escaped them." The men stared toward the horizon that night, the Persian desert glowing red beneath the setting Sunday. They had escaped Siberia's cold, but not its ghosts. When the war ended, the survivors of Anders' army did not go home because home no longer existed. Poland, the country they had fought for, now lay beneath a new flag, ruled by the same hand that had buried their comrades in Katyn. Major Tadeusz Robel, once a prisoner in Siberia, now stood in uniform on Italian soil, watching other soldiers celebrate victory. For him, there was none. "We were free men," he wrote, "but our country was still in chains. The soldiers who returned to Poland were met not with medals, but with suspicion. The new communist regime called them traitors, tools of the West. Many were arrested, interrogated, or vanished again into the same Soviet darkness they had fled. Others remained abroad in Britain, Canada, Palestine, exiles carrying both pride and guilt. Letters home spoke of silence. Families could not mention Katyn. The truth had become treason. Soviet propaganda rewrote history, naming the Nazis as the killers, erasing the Soviets from blame. For decades, the lie stood unchallenged even as survivors aged, their memories sharper than the wounds that never healed. And yet, beneath the silence, something endured. Hidden diaries, buried photographs, whispered names, all kept alive the memory of those lost in the forest. Robel's final entry, written in London in 1958, read, "We could not bring our brothers home, but we carried their story across the world. One day, Poland will speak their names again." When Poland finally did in 1990, it was too late for most who had seen Siberia. But their truth had outlived empires. Decades later, the snows of Siberia still haunted their dreams. The crack of frozen branches, the hiss of steam from dying fires, echoes of a world that refused to vanish. But history, like spring, cannot stay buried forever. In April 1990, the Soviet Union finally admitted responsibility for the Katyn massacre. For the survivors scattered across the world, it was not triumph, only truth. Tadeusz Robel, now an old man, sat before a small radio in London as the announcement played. Tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. 47 years, he whispered, and the earth finally speaks. In that moment, the long journey found its end. The liberation that had led them to Siberia, the suffering, the marches, the exile, all formed a single thread in Poland's long struggle to reclaim its soul. From the snows of Vorkuta to the deserts of Persia, from Tehran to Monte Cassino, the Poles had carried something the Soviets could never crush: the will to remember. When Robel died in 1993, his diary was found open to one final line. "We learned in Siberia that freedom is not a gift. It is the courage to tell the truth, even when it costs everything." The truth of Katyn, once buried beneath snow and silence, had returned to light not as vengeance but as vindication. And so, at last, the men who vanished into Siberia were no longer prisoners of history.